Yes, I wrote this book in response to the Christchurch Massacre, and I wrote it out of a concern that the claim by the perpetrator to be a fascist and to be conducting his massacre as part of his fascism was not being taken seriously. It seemed to me that we needed to understand what this meant, what fascism meant in the 21st century, and how it might lead a young Australian man to carry out such a vile action. Because if we didn't understand it, we would be unable to prevent it from happening again. And so what I try to do in the book is outline the ideas expressed by the perpetrator, to put them into the context of classical fascism, and then to explain the extent to which they differ from the fascism of the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly in the context of the online sphere with which the perpetrator was very well attached. And what I suggest in the book is that the perpetrator represented, as he said explicitly, a form of genuine fascism, but a fascism that had mutated in the different circumstances of the 21st century. And I conclude by suggesting that the massacre was conducted as a deliberate strategy, and it was conducted as a strategy intended to inspire other people to imitate it. And in fact, since the book has been published, we've seen a number of imitations that show that in some respects, the strategy is in fact working. So one of the arguments I suggest is that if we want to stop other young men doing similar deeds, then we need to understand their ideas, and only in that way can we stop them. The perpetrator of the Christchurch Massacre has an interesting background in that he was not, as some in the media suggested, somebody who was simply disturbed and didn't know what he was doing. He was someone, in fact, who was steeped in fascist theory and history and quite widely read in that tradition. But at the same time, he was very much a product of the 21st century. And so he was very much associated with the online troll culture that we attribute to places like 8chan. And for listeners who aren't familiar with 8chan, it's an uncensored bulletin board that brings together white nationalists of all variety, but is also sort of responsible for establishing a sort of distinctive sensibility that has allowed the far right to grow online. That is, that the people who post on 8chan and who are influenced by it use a very sort of deep and prevailing irony and cynicism. So it's very difficult to understand what they are saying. And so the kind of culture that we associated with the alt-right very much comes out of those locations where you will see these provocateurs who will say something and they will sort of be joking, but they will sort of not be joking as well. That's very much the sort of sensibility that the perpetrator was associated with. And one of the points that I want to make in the book is that this stuff needs to be taken seriously, that these provocations are not just jokes, they can't simply be laughed off, and they have serious consequences. The vast majority of people who congregate on places like 8chan are simply, disaffected teenagers who are there for transgressive thrills, but you only need one or two who have access to serious weapons, and you get something like the Christchurch Massacre. So I think it's something that needs to be taken seriously. So wading into the world inhabited by the perpetrator of the massacre and the kinds of people associated with him was a fairly bleak experience. Fascism is a philosophy indelibly associated with violence that obviously reaches its peak with the Holocaust, but violence is not an add-on to fascism. It's central to it. This notion of a redemption that comes through violence, both for individuals and the society. And so, because it's such a bleak philosophy, one has to ask oneself, in what circumstances does it find adherence? In what circumstances do people find it attractive? And that's particularly the case when you look at the horrific nihilism coming out of places like Chan. How is it that this appeals to millions of young men online? And one of the points that I try to make in the book is that these are ideas that flourish in the absence of hope, that they attract people who feel that something has gone terribly wrong with the world. They can't put their finger on what it is, and the ideas of fascism give them some sort of way of taking control of a world that seems to them to be out of their control. And if you think of the 21st century and the direction in which it's going, you can see how these ideas might begin to get more and more of a foothold. One of the interesting aspects of the philosophy espoused by the perpetrator is that he describes himself as a fascist, but he also describes himself as an eco-fascist. That is, he writes about climate change and says, in fact, the solution to climate change is violence directed against immigrants to keep them out, and minorities to reduce the population so we can live sustainable. Now, again, these are horrific, murderous ideas, and they reach their fruition in Christchurch, but they are ideas that can establish a foothold in a context where something like climate change seems unstoppable. So, I'm of a generation where when I was growing up, it was more or less taken for granted that the world was slowly getting better. That there was sexism and there was racism and there was prejudice and there was poverty, but these things were slowly being overcome, and we could look forward to these things being a legacy of the past. Well, the world we're in now, I doubt that there are very many people who feel like that anymore. Instead, people have a kind of terrible sense that the world is spiraling out of control, that their children will live a worse life than they did, and in fact that we are heading for all sorts of horrific events. Well, in that kind of context, the notion of destructive nihilism and redeeming the world through this cataclysmic violence can begin to seem attractive. And so in that sense, yes, I think we do need to be proactive. We need to fight fascists wherever they appear, but we also need to start to show that the world can be made better, that there is an alternative to prejudice, to racism and to sexism, that we can not simply push back against fascists and other bigots here and there, but we can actually make a world where such ideas have no traction whatsoever, and we can do something about climate change. We can mend the planet. Now, it's easier to say this in the abstract than to actually put forward solutions to all of these problems. But I think that unless we begin to show that we have ideas to improve the world, we can expect these very dark ideas to keep coming back again and again and again. That's a really interesting question. So the phenomena of eco-fascism is at the moment a tiny minority current. The vast majority of people who say that they are concerned about the environment identify with progressive ideas and would be horrified by any suggestion, of association with fascism. On the other hand, there is a historical tradition of right-wing environmentalism, stretching back both in Europe and the United States. So if you look at the early history of the American environmental movement, some of the key figures were eugenicists were anti-immigrant campaigners. And in Europe, of course, there are all sorts of quite disturbing associations between a right-wing romanticism in the capital R sense, environmental politics, and the far right. We only have to think about the traditions of National Socialism and ideas of blood and soil, and the association of the association between the landscape and a mystical kind of nationalism, to see that there are some dark directions that environmental arguments can be taken by certain kind of forces. So as yet, I think that that kind of right-wing environmentalism is not a major force, although it is interesting that across Europe, many of the far-right organisations now are beginning to talk about climate change and beginning to put forward anti-immigrant versions of environmentalism. And I think that this is going to be something that we are all going to have to deal with, because of course you only have to think about what are the likely, or what do the scientists say that climate change will bring. One of the things that they say is that one of the manifestations of a warming planet will be a massive increase in, for instance, climate refugees. And so you can see how in that context there may well be an association between responses to climate change and hostility to refugees and asylum seekers. And so that these different ideas could come together in quite horrible sorts of ways, you know, and a sort of Fortress Australia response to climate change, if you see what I mean. So I think it is something that we need to be cogent of, and in that sense, the terrible deeds of the Christchurch perpetrator are a kind of straw in the wind, if you like. Yes. Okay. So there are two parts to that question. I'll answer them in a sequence. Do I think that Australians are aware of the threat of fascism? I think the answer to that is no. I think there was a concerted effort in the wake of the Christchurch Massacre initially to say that the perpetrator had nothing to do with Australia. And then, when it became apparent that in fact, you know, he was from Grafton and was very well connected to the local far right organisations, there was a brief flurry of concern about that, and then the subject was well nigh dropped. Now, I want to be careful about what I'm saying, because I don't want to create the impression that I think fascism is a major threat in Australia, because it isn't. The fascist movement in Australia is tiny, and one of the arguments that I make in the book is that one of the reasons the perpetrator did what he did was because that the local fascists were so frustrated about their inability to turn the real support that they had online into real world activity. So they knew they could they knew that they could get lots and lots of traffic to their, you know, to their social media or to their videos or whatever, but whenever they would try to have, you know, meetings or events or whatever, they would get a handful of people, and, you know, and then their very organizations variously collapsed. And it was in that context, with the local luminaries of the fascist right having a big debate about the way forward, that the perpetrator of the massacre put forward his own strategy, which was essentially fascist terrorism. So in that sense, I think, in a funny kind of way, we can see the events in Christchurch as, in fact, indicating the inability of the fascist movement in Australia to grow. That being said, if you look at the timeline of the events up to Christchurch, you can see that there was a moment there where white nationalist ideas were getting an extraordinary degree of prominence in the Australian media. So we had a whole series of events. We had a number of prominent alt-right personalities visiting Australia and being feted in the mainstream media. We had a woman called Lauren Southern, who had made a YouTube video called The Great Replacement, which was the name that the Christchurch perpetrator gave to his document, come to Australia and receive glowing media accounts in most media reports in the tabloid media, being feted on Sky News and going on Sky News and talking about her theories about white genocide. We had an article by a leading tabloid journalist in Australia talking about immigration being invasion, and talking about the numbers of people of different ethnicities in different suburbs. In fact, counting the percentages of Jews in Caulfield, for instance. And this is being published in what the biggest selling tabloid in Australia. We had an Australian senator attending a white nationalist rally in St Kilda alongside figures who were avowed supporters of Adolf Hitler. All of this was happening in the space of several months, and the Christchurch events put a stop to it, and rightfully so. But I do think that there needs to be a degree of accountability of how, people who say that they think a picture of Adolf Hitler should be hung in every school could receive platforms on the ABC and Sky News. It's just extraordinary and needs to be faced up to. The second part of your question was about how these questions should be taught in schools, wasn't it? That was the second part of the. And I think that's a really interesting question. I think definitely these are questions that do need to be addressed in the curriculum, that we can't afford to have ignorance about the events of the 1930s and the 1940s. And we're already seeing some recent surveys showing that the level of historical knowledge about these events is actually surprisingly low. So I think that is tremendously important. But I also think that we need to talk about educating both students and educators about what happens online. Because one of the phenomena that I talk about in the book is the ability of the far right to recruit people online without their parents or their teachers knowing what's happening or being able to understand it. And so in that sense, one of the responses to the Christchurch events was an argument that said, well, look, we shouldn't give these people publicity. We shouldn't talk about their ideas, because that will simply encourage them. And I think it's that, while well-meaning, is actually a very dangerous argument, that we do need to talk about these ideas because they are not very well understood. And because they are not well understood, it makes it very difficult for parents and for teachers to know when, a son or a daughter or a student is coming under the influence of these people. And again, if you don't understand these ideas, then you're not able to combat them. So how exactly one does this and what such a curriculum might look like, I don't have any pat answer to that. I think it's a very difficult kind of question, but I definitely think it should be something that people are taught.